It began on a quiet suburban street where every house looked almost identical. The lawns were trimmed within an inch of their lives, and the rules of the homeowners association were enforced like commandments. For years, I had lived in relative peace there, going about my days without much thought about the petty politics of the neighborhood. That all changed the day Karen moved in 2 doors down. At first, her presence was barely noticeable. A middle-aged woman with a permanent scowl and a suspicious glare, she seemed to scan the neighborhood as though it were her personal kingdom. Neighbors whispered warnings about her, the type who measured grass with a ruler, reported trash cans left out for too long, and complained about decorations that weren't in keeping with community aesthetics. I brushed it off, thinking her antics wouldn't affect me. I couldn't have been more wrong. The trouble began after one Saturday evening when I had a couple of friends over. It wasn't a wild party, just some background music, conversation, and laughter that floated into the night. Nothing unusual. But apparently, even the faintest sound past 9 o'clock was unacceptable to Karen. The next morning, taped to my front door, was an official-looking letter from the HOA stating that they had received a noise complaint from my concerned neighbor. At first, I laughed. It seemed ridiculous that anyone would complain about such a harmless evening. But then I noticed the wording in the letter. It wasn't just a warning. It mentioned fines if the disturbances continued. This wasn't just pettiness. This was an attack. I let it go for the moment, chalking it up to Karen's need for control. But within a week, it happened again. This time I wasn't even hosting anyone. I was alone, cooking dinner, with music playing softly in the background. It couldn't have been heard beyond the walls of my home. Yet once more I received a complaint. Again, a threat of fines. That was when the frustration started to sink in. I realized this wasn't about noise. It was about Karen's obsession with control. She had found a target, and I was it. What baffled me most was that no other neighbor had ever expressed concern. In fact, some even joked that they wished there were more life in the community because it was so dull. No one else seemed to hear these so-called disturbances. Yet the HOA board treated Karen's words like gospel. It became a pattern. Every small sound was exaggerated into a full-blown accusation. If I mowed my lawn in the evening, a complaint would follow. If I closed my car door too loudly, I'd hear about it the next day. The more she complained, the more the board seemed to hover over me, scrutinizing everything I did. But here's where the story starts to twist. Because while Karen was busy portraying me as the neighborhood nuisance, I began noticing strange things about her house. Lights would flicker at odd hours. Cars I didn't recognize would pull into her driveway late at night and leave in the early morning. Sometimes the faint hum of machinery could be heard through her basement windows. Though no one else seemed to notice or care, at first I ignored it. After all, it wasn't my business what she did in her own home. But as the complaints against me piled higher, my patience wore thin. If she was determined to make my life miserable, then maybe it was time to look a little closer at hers. One night, unable to sleep, I sat by my window with the lights off. I watched as another unfamiliar car pulled into her driveway. The driver was carrying boxes, large, heavy-looking ones. They disappeared into her basement entrance. Minutes later, Karen emerged briefly, glanced around the street nervously, and then went back inside. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The complaints against me continued weekly, each one more exaggerated than the last. She accused me of blasting music at midnight, though I had been asleep by 10. She claimed there were rowdy parties at my house when I hadn't had visitors in weeks. The lies piled up, and the HOA began threatening me with steep fines. Even legal action. I was being painted as a villain. But I wasn't the one hiding things. By then, I knew one thing for certain. Karen had secrets. And if I wanted to clear my name and put an end to her harassment, I needed to uncover exactly what they were. The opportunity came sooner than expected. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed Karen struggling with a stack of papers she was carrying from her car. A gust of wind caught them, scattering documents across her lawn. She scrambled to gather them, cursing under her breath, but not before I saw a bold heading on one of the pages. Property violation. Unauthorized rental activity. My heart raced. Unauthorized rental activity. Suddenly, the odd cars, the late-night visitors, and the strange basement noises all made sense. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was running something she didn't want anyone to know about. In that moment, a plan began to form. If Karen wanted to play the game of complaints, I was ready to play too. Except this time, I would play smarter. The pieces were falling into place, and I knew the truth was close at hand. But exposing her wouldn't be easy. It would take patience, evidence, and strategy. And I had just enough anger built up to fuel me through it. Karen thought she had the upper hand. She thought she could push me into silence with her false reports. But she underestimated one thing. The louder she accused me, the closer I was to exposing the very secret that could bring her crashing down. The stage was set. The battle between Karen and me had only just begun, and while she thought she was silencing me, she was unknowingly digging her own grave, because soon, the entire neighborhood would know what she was hiding in that basement. Once I had seen that paper slip across Karen's lawn, the words unauthorized rental activity burned into my mind like a neon sign. Suddenly, everything clicked together. Karen wasn't the upstanding, self-appointed neighborhood enforcer she pretended to be. She was hiding something. And if there was one thing Karen loved more than control, it was hypocrisy. But knowing something and proving it were two different things. The HOA, as much as they loved her complaints about me, wasn't going to take my word without solid evidence. Karen had clearly been careful to keep her activities quiet. That explained the basement activity, the late-night cars, the hushed exchanges. If I was going to expose her, I had to be just as meticulous as she was petty. The first step was observation. Over the next several weeks, I began to keep track of what went on around her property. Every car that came and went, every late-night delivery, every flicker of light from those basement windows. At first, I felt ridiculous, like some amateur detective with a vendetta. But the more I watched, the more the picture came into focus. The cars weren't random. They came on a schedule. Sometimes the same vehicles, sometimes different. Always at odd hours. Always staying just long enough to unload boxes or disappear into the basement for an hour or two. And it wasn't just the cars. On more than one occasion, I noticed strangers loitering near her driveway, waiting until Karen herself appeared to usher them inside. Meanwhile, the complaints against me only grew more absurd. I received letters accusing me of running a nightclub in my home. According to Karen, dozens of people were coming and going at all hours, disturbing the peace. The HOA cited her statements from concerned neighbors, though when I asked who these neighbors were, they refused to disclose any names. It was clear to me by now that Karen had ingratiated herself with certain members of the board, feeding them a steady diet of exaggerated lies about me while presenting herself as the model homeowner. Every letter from the HOA only fueled my determination. If she wanted a battle of documentation, then I would give her one. I began logging every detail. Time-stamped notes, photos from my phone of the unusual activity, even recordings of the suspicious hum from her basement. I wasn't sure what she was doing yet, but I knew it wasn't legal. At one point, I considered confronting her directly. But I knew better. Karen was the type who thrived on confrontation, twisting any exchange into ammunition for her endless complaints. If I gave her that satisfaction, she'd spin it into proof that I was unstable or aggressive. No, this had to be done carefully, quietly. I needed undeniable proof before I could expose her. The opportunity came during a routine walk around the neighborhood. As I passed her house, I noticed her trash can sitting by the curb. Normally, nothing unusual. But one of the lids was slightly ajar, and inside I spotted a pile of flattened cardboard boxes. The labels on them caught my eye. They weren't household brands or grocery boxes. They were industrial packaging, bulk shipments of electronics, cleaning supplies, even bottled drinks. Far more than a single person living alone would ever need. That was the first crack. Karen wasn't just hoarding things for herself. She was moving goods. And judging by the volume, it wasn't small time. I began piecing together a theory. She was likely renting out her basement to store merchandise, or worse, running an illegal short-term rental setup with rotating tenants who stayed under the radar. Either way, it explained the cars, the people, the deliveries. And it explained why she was so desperate to paint me as the neighborhood problem, because if the HOA ever turned its gaze on her, her little operation would come crashing down. But catching her wouldn't be easy. Karen was paranoid. She rarely left her house unattended for long. The curtains were always drawn, and she seemed to have a sixth sense for when people were watching her. That's when I realized I didn't have to expose her alone. If she wanted to play the game of gossip and complaints, maybe it was time to use her own tactics against her. Quietly, I started planting seeds with other neighbors. Not accusations, not wild stories, just observations. I'd casually mention how often I noticed different cars pulling up to her driveway late at night, or how I thought it was odd that so many strangers were going in and out of her basement. I didn't have to push hard. In a community where people thrived on speculation and rumor, curiosity spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before I overheard others whispering about Karen. Questions circulated at the HOA meetings. Who were all those people at her house? Why was her basement lit at 3 in the morning? The same neighbors who once believed every word of her complaints about me were starting to turn their attention toward her. And still, the complaints against me came in, though they started to sound desperate. One letter accused me of running heavy machinery at night. Another claimed she had witnessed dangerous activity on my property. Each one was more absurd than the last, and each one made her sound less credible. Then came the break I had been waiting for. One evening, as I passed by on my way home, I noticed her basement door slightly open. A crack of light spilled out onto the driveway. Normally, Karen would never leave something like that unattended. I slowed my pace, heart racing, and glanced inside. What I saw confirmed everything. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, clearly stored for distribution. Shelves full of cleaning supplies, bulk food packages, and electronics filled the space. It was no innocent storage closet. She was running an underground operation out of her basement. I didn't dare linger long, but I had seen enough. Now all I needed was proof I could present to the HOA, or better yet, the city. Something undeniable, something she couldn't wriggle out of with her usual excuses. The pieces were aligning. The complaints against me, the strange activity, the hypocrisy. It all pointed toward the truth I had been building toward. But as I prepared to expose her, I realized I wasn't the only one watching. From across the street, another neighbor stood silently on their porch, eyes fixed on Karen's basement. I wasn't alone in my suspicions anymore, and if others were starting to see what I saw, it was only a matter of time before Karen's carefully constructed image began to collapse. By the time I caught that glimpse inside Karen's basement, I knew I had her cornered. The stacks of boxes, the shelves of bulk goods, the stream of strangers coming and going, it was undeniable. She wasn't just an overbearing neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was running something she desperately needed to keep secret. And she was hiding it in plain sight, all while accusing me of disturbing the neighborhood's peace. But Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. If anything, it seemed like she sensed that the tide of suspicion was beginning to shift against her. And in response, she doubled down on her attacks against me. The next letter from the HOA wasn't just a complaint, it was a full-blown threat. According to Karen's testimony, I had been endangering the community with reckless behavior. She claimed she saw strange individuals entering and leaving my property at night, that she smelled chemicals from my garage, and that she feared I was running some kind of operation out of my own home. The irony was almost laughable. She had flipped the very accusations that could easily be applied to her and redirected them at me. The HOA board took her words seriously. Too seriously? They scheduled an official inspection of my property, citing ongoing disturbances and potential violations. I couldn't believe it. After all the evidence I'd gathered, after all the neighbors who had begun whispering about Karen's late-night activities, the board still treated me as the problem. It was infuriating, but it was also a gift in disguise. When the board came to inspect my home, they found nothing. No strangers, no chemicals, no disturbances. Just a clean, quiet house with no violations. The inspection cleared me completely, and though Karen had hoped it would cement her accusations, all it really did was make her look foolish. Still, she wasn't done. If anything, she escalated. The very next week, someone had vandalized my lawn. Trash was scattered across the grass. A smear of something foul splattered across my driveway. It was obvious who was behind it, though I had no proof. Karen stood across the street that morning, sipping coffee from her porch, her smirk barely hidden. She wanted me rattled. She wanted me to react. I didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I cleaned up the mess, logged the incident, and added it to my growing file of evidence. If Karen wanted a war of attrition, then I would fight with patience. Every petty stunt she pulled was just another nail in the coffin of her credibility. But the real turning point came when one of the neighbors I had quietly spoken to approached me. She was tired of Karen's antics, tired of the lies, and most of all, tired of the constant traffic in and out of Karen's basement. She told me she had seen people exchanging money with Karen at her door. That was the missing piece, the financial side. If Karen was profiting from unauthorized rentals or selling goods under the table, then it wasn't just a nuisance. It was a direct violation of both HOA and city laws. Together, we formed a plan. I would continue to document the traffic and activities around Karen's property, while my neighbor reached out discreetly to others on the street. The goal wasn't just to expose her, it was to build a coalition of voices. If enough residents spoke up, the HOA would no longer be able to dismiss the evidence as one person's grudge. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign of harassment. She reported me for excessive lawn watering. She complained that my recycling bin wasn't properly sorted. She even accused me of leaving my porch light on too long at night, claiming it disrupted the natural environment. Each complaint was more ridiculous than the last, and each one chipped away at her veneer of authority. And yet, beneath her aggression, I could sense her growing desperation. She began glancing around nervously when she left her house. The smug confidence she once carried seemed to falter, replaced by an edge of paranoia. She must have realized that people were watching her more closely now. One night, as I sat by my window recording notes, I saw it happen. A car pulled up, and a man climbed out carrying a duffel bag. Karen rushed out to meet him, whispering harshly, her eyes darting across the street as if she knew she was being observed. The man handed her the bag, and she ushered him quickly into the basement. Minutes later, they re-emerged, this time with Karen carrying a wad of cash that she slipped into her purse before sending him on his way. It was exactly the kind of evidence I needed. I snapped photos through the blinds, capturing the exchange. Now I had proof, not just of suspicious activity, but of money-changing hands. Still, I knew I couldn't rely on blurry photos alone. I needed airtight documentation, something the HOA and possibly even law enforcement couldn't ignore. I considered installing cameras around my property that conveniently captured her driveway in the background. I even thought about filing an anonymous report to city code enforcement. But part of me wanted to play this out just a little longer, to let Karen dig her own hole deeper before I delivered the final blow, and dig she did. Perhaps sensing the walls closing in, Karen ramped up her smear campaign. She cornered other neighbors, warning them that I was unstable, that I was out to ruin her life. She spread rumors that I was jobless, that I was behind on my mortgage, that I was the true threat to the neighborhood. For a time, I worried that her lies might stick. But then something remarkable happened. The neighbors she tried to sway began pushing back. Some openly questioned why she was always so focused on me when her own house had constant traffic. Others started avoiding her altogether, unwilling to get dragged into her drama. Slowly, the tide turned. By the end of that month, Karen's fortress of lies was crumbling. The same board that once treated her like their star witness now eyed her with suspicion. The same neighbors who once nodded along with her complaints now whispered about her behind her back. And all the while, my file of evidence against her grew thicker. The showdown was inevitable. Karen had struck back with every weapon she could muster: complaints, lies, vandalism, rumors. But in doing so, she had revealed just how desperate she was to keep her own secret buried. And secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, always find their way into the light. By now, Karen's reign of control was beginning to falter. She had spent months trying to cast me as the neighborhood menace, but her accusations were starting to sound like background noise. Even the HOA board members, who once parroted her every complaint, were beginning to glance at each other with doubt when her letters arrived. Still, Karen wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. She wore her self-proclaimed title of protector of the community like a crown, and she would fight tooth and nail to keep it. The neighborhood, however, was changing. What Karen hadn't realized was that her obsession with me had drawn attention away from her carefully guarded secret. More neighbors were noticing the parade of strangers at her house. More were whispering about the odd hours, the heavy boxes, the late-night exchanges. The seeds I had planted weeks before were sprouting, and Karen's crown of authority was beginning to crack. But for me, suspicion wasn't enough. I needed undeniable proof, so I upgraded my strategy. I installed a small security camera above my garage, not aimed directly at Karen's property, but angled just enough to capture my driveway. Conveniently, that view also included a portion of her basement entrance. It was all perfectly legal. And within days, the footage began to tell a story Karen could no longer deny. I captured video of cars pulling into her driveway at 2 a.m, footage of strangers unloading boxes and disappearing into her basement, clips of Karen exchanging envelopes with men who left within minutes. And perhaps the most damning of all, I recorded her dragging out bags of trash far too heavy to be filled with anything ordinary. Every file I saved, every clip I logged, was another brick in the wall of evidence I was building against her. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior grew more frantic. She showed up at HOA meetings armed with stacks of paper, demanding action against me. Her evidence included photos of my porch light glowing at night, recordings of crickets chirping near my backyard, even claims that my dog barked too loudly when the mailman came by. The board members sat through her tirades with forced patience, but the exhaustion in their eyes was obvious. Neighbors began to openly question her. One asked why she was so invested in what I did when she had so many guests at her own home. Another suggested that maybe the noise she complained about wasn't even coming from my house at all. Karen brushed off their comments with a laugh that sounded more like a hiss, but I could see the cracks forming in her facade. Then came the moment that shifted everything. One evening, I was reviewing my security footage when I caught something unexpected. A car pulled into her driveway. This one older, with city insignias faintly visible on the doors. Two men stepped out, clipboards in hand, and Karen rushed to meet them at the door. They weren't neighbors. They weren't customers. They were inspectors. It seemed that someone else, maybe one of the neighbors I had quietly spoken with, had reported her to the city. My heart pounded as I watched her escort them inside, her body language stiff, defensive. When they finally emerged an hour later, Karen's expression was pale and tight, her forced smile betraying the panic brewing beneath the surface. That was the first time I realized she wasn't untouchable. The HOA could shield her with favoritism, but the city? That was different. She was vulnerable now, and she knew it. But instead of retreating, Karen lashed out harder. The very next day, I found another letter taped to my door. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was handwritten, unsigned, but the tone was unmistakable. It accused me of spying on her, of harassment, and warned me that I was being watched. It wasn't just petty anymore. It was a threat. I kept the letter, of course, adding it to my growing file. And though I felt a chill creep up my spine, it only hardened my resolve. Karen was flailing, and desperate people made mistakes. Sure enough, her desperation escalated. That weekend, during another HOA meeting, Karen demanded that I be fined for disturbing the peace again. But this time, something shifted. Instead of nodding along, the board asked for evidence. Actual evidence. And when Karen waved around her usual stack of vague accusations, the board pressed further. Where were the witnesses? Where were the recordings? Where was the proof? Karen faltered. For the first time since this feud began, she didn't have an answer. That meeting was the turning point. I could see the doubt spreading through the room, spreading through the neighborhood. Her crown was slipping, her grip on power loosening with every baseless word. And yet, I knew she wouldn't give up quietly. She had invested too much in this charade to walk away without a fight, sure enough. The following night, my security camera caught something I never expected. Karen herself creeping across my lawn under cover of darkness. She crouched by my garage, fiddling with something near the base of my camera. The footage clearly showed her face illuminated by the glow of the porch light, her expression twisted in frustration. Moments later, the screen went black. She had cut the wires. It was the mistake I had been waiting for. What she didn't realize was that the camera wasn't the only one I had installed. A second, smaller unit was tucked under the eaves of my roof, angled perfectly to catch her in the act of tampering with the first. The next morning, I downloaded the footage and watched it twice, my pulse racing. Karen had crossed the line from nuisance into criminal. She wasn't just filing complaints or spreading rumors anymore. She had trespassed onto my property, vandalized my equipment, and left behind undeniable proof. And with that, the balance of power shifted completely. The file I had been building was now complete. Photos, videos, logs, testimonies, and the crowning jewel. A recording of Karen herself committing a crime against me. The time for patience was over. It was time to show Karen, the HOA, and the entire neighborhood exactly who had been too loud all along. The file was ready. Weeks of logging, recording, and documenting had built into something undeniable, something that not even Karen's sharp tongue or her allies on the HOA board could twist away. For months, she had tried to brand me as the noisy neighbor, the supposed menace of the community. But now, the truth was heavy in my hands, and it was time to let it speak louder than her lies ever could. I didn't rush into it. Timing mattered. If I showed my hand too early, Karen might find a way to spin the story, to paint herself as the victim of a witch hunt. No, I had to wait until the HOA meeting, when she had the biggest audience, when the board and the neighbors were gathered together. That would be the moment her kingdom would crumble. In the days leading up to the meeting, Karen was relentless. She left flyers on neighbors' doors warning about community dangers. She spread fresh rumors about me, claiming I was harassing her, that I was obsessively spying on her property. Each lie was laced with the desperation of someone who felt her grip slipping. And though a few neighbors raised their eyebrows, most were simply tired of her antics. When the night of the meeting arrived, I came prepared. Laptop in hand, evidence neatly organized into folders, I walked into that bland community hall knowing this would be the night everything changed. Karen was already there, of course, perched at the front like a self-appointed queen, a thick binder of complaints stacked beside her. She shot me a glare sharp enough to cut glass, but I didn't flinch. The meeting started as usual, with mundane updates about landscaping budgets and upcoming neighborhood events. But soon enough, Karen raised her hand, demanding to be heard. She launched into another tirade about me, how I had terrorized her with noise, how I was a danger to the community, how I should be fined or even removed from the neighborhood altogether. Her voice was shrill, her gestures dramatic. She had clearly rehearsed this performance, banking on the board's sympathy. When she finally paused, I raised my hand. Calmly, deliberately, I asked for a chance to respond. The room quieted. The board nodded. It was my turn. I began by acknowledging Karen's concerns, careful not to sound defensive. But then, I opened my laptop and projected the first video onto the screen. There she was, Karen's driveway, lit by the harsh glow of my security camera, cars pulling in at 2 a.m. Strangers unloading boxes, slipping into her basement. The room murmured. Karen's smile faltered. Then, clip after clip, I laid it out. Envelopes exchanged for cash. Late-night visitors. Industrial boxes tossed into her trash bins. And finally, the crown jewel. Footage of Karen herself creeping across my lawn, cutting the wires to my security camera. The image of her caught red-handed froze on the screen like a portrait of hypocrisy. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen sputtered. Her face flushed red, but her words stumbled out incoherently. She tried to claim the footage was doctored, that I was framing her. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The timestamps, the clarity, the sheer volume of material, it all told a story that no amount of denial could erase. The board shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One member cleared his throat and asked Karen directly if she had been conducting unauthorized activity from her home. She stammered, dodged, then lashed out, accusing me of harassment again. But no one was buying it anymore. Neighbors who had once nodded along with her complaints now glared at her with open disgust. One even spoke up, recounting how they had seen strangers at her property too. Another admitted they had reported her to the city after witnessing late-night deliveries. The tide had turned completely. Karen's crown shattered that night. The board announced an immediate investigation into her activities. They suspended her ability to file complaints until the matter was resolved. And as for me, I was officially cleared of all accusations. Every fine, every warning letter, wiped clean. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't the villain of the neighborhood anymore. I was the one who had endured, the one who had pulled back the curtain to reveal the truth. But Karen didn't take her fall gracefully. In the days after the meeting, she lashed out in every way she could. She screamed at neighbors in the street, accusing them of betrayal. She posted rants on the community bulletin board, calling me a liar and a stalker. She even tried to confront me directly, standing on the edge of my driveway and yelling about privacy and harassment. But every time she opened her mouth, she only made herself look worse. The HOA board, once her loyal army, grew weary of her antics. Neighbors who had once avoided crossing her now walked past her house without so much as a glance. Her isolation was swift and brutal. Still, I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to admit defeat. Even as her kingdom crumbled, she was plotting, scheming, desperate for a way to claw back her power. And I was right, because just when I thought the storm had passed, Karen made one last, desperate move. One evening, I noticed flashing lights outside her house. A police car. I stepped out cautiously, watching as officers knocked on her door. Karen emerged, animated and frantic, pointing in my direction. She was making a report against me. Again. It was her last card, her final attempt to weaponize authority against me. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Because I had something she didn't. The truth. The officers listened patiently to her accusations, then turned to me. Calmly, I handed them a flash drive with the same evidence I had shown the HOA. I explained everything, the complaints, the vandalism, the footage of her trespassing on my property. The officers took their time reviewing it, and as Karen's ranting grew louder, their expressions grew colder. Finally, they warned her. If she continued making false reports, she could face charges The look on her face as they drove away told me everything. Her final weapon had backfired. Karen wasn't just losing her crown anymore. She was losing everything. By the time the police left her doorstep, Karen was no longer the terror of the neighborhood. She was exposed, discredited, and isolated. Yet even as her influence crumbled, she clung to the remnants of her power with a kind of desperate fury. Watching her unravel was both satisfying and unsettling, because I knew people like Karen rarely went quietly. The HOA board moved quickly after the meeting. An official notice was sent to Karen, informing her that her property would undergo inspection due to suspected unauthorized rental and commercial activity. The irony was bitter. For months, she had demanded inspections of my home, desperate to catch me in some violation. Now, it was her turn to face the scrutiny she had inflicted on everyone else. The inspection revealed exactly what I had already suspected. Karen had been renting out her basement as an unlicensed short-term unit, turning it into a revolving door of temporary tenants. On top of that, she had been storing and distributing bulk goods without any permits. It wasn't just a violation of HOA rules, it was a violation of city ordinances. The fines were staggering. The fallout spread quickly. Word rippled through the neighborhood, carried in whispers that grew louder with each retelling. Karen, who once strutted down the street with an air of superiority, could no longer step outside without feeling the burn of a dozen eyes. The same neighbors who once tolerated her control now openly mocked her hypocrisy. Her reputation was in tatters, but the punishment didn't end there. The HOA stripped her of any influence she once had. She was barred from board meetings until her violations were resolved. Every one of her previous complaints was reviewed and dismissed, exposing the pettiness of her campaign against me. And though she tried to fight back with appeals and letters filled with venom, the board barely acknowledged her anymore. Karen's house became a symbol of her downfall. The traffic of strangers vanished overnight, replaced by silence that felt almost eerie. The basement windows stayed dark. Her porch, once decorated with smug little signs about community pride, grew bare. Even her front yard began to show neglect, weeds sprouting in patches where she once demanded perfection from others. Meanwhile, life for me returned to something I hadn't felt in months: peace. I could mow my lawn without fear of a letter arriving the next day. I could have friends over without worrying about a bogus complaint. I could simply live in my own home, free from the constant shadow of Karen's obsession. Neighbors began to treat me differently too. Where once they had eyed me with suspicion, they now stopped to chat, apologizing for believing her lies. Some even thanked me for standing up to her, for pulling back the curtain on the woman who had ruled with fear and pettiness for so long. But Karen wasn't finished. Not entirely. She still tried to claw her way back, filing one last desperate complaint with the city, accusing me of harassment and stalking. It went nowhere. With the evidence stacked against her, with her own history of false reports documented, the city dismissed her claims almost immediately. And this time the warning wasn't just verbal. Karen was informed that any further false accusations could result in charges. That was the final blow. From that moment on, Karen retreated. Her voice, once the loudest in the room, was silenced. Her crown was gone, her throne dismantled, her influence stripped away piece by piece. She remained in the neighborhood physically, but her presence was more like a shadow, visible but powerless. Months passed, and the memory of her reign became just another story whispered at block parties and HOA gatherings. New families moved in, and when they asked about the woman 2 doors down, the neighbors would exchange knowing glances and shake their heads. Karen had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly control could slip when the truth came to light. For me, the ordeal left scars, but also lessons. I learned how dangerous unchecked authority could be, how damaging lies could become when repeated often enough, and how important it was to stand firm in the face of injustice. Karen had tried to drown me in noise, complaints, rumors, accusations. But in the end, it was her own secrets that made the loudest sound of all. Looking back, I almost felt pity for her. Almost. She had built her identity on control, on fear, on the illusion of being the community's guardian. But beneath it all, she was just another hypocrite hiding behind rules she never intended to follow herself. And when the mask slipped, when her secret was exposed, the silence that followed was deafening. Today, when I sit on my porch in the evening, I sometimes glance down the street at Karen's house. The blinds are always closed now. The driveway is empty, the basement dark. It's as if the house itself is holding its breath, ashamed of the chaos it once concealed. The neighborhood is quieter these days. Not because Karen succeeded in silencing anyone else, but because her voice is gone. And in that quiet, there's a peace she could never manufacture through rules and complaints. Karen once called me too loud. But in the end, it wasn't my voice that echoed through the neighborhood. It was hers. And that echo told everyone exactly who she really was.